Black Land Ownership is a grassroots organization founded by me, Chris Carr, and Melissa Hunter-Gurney, who's an educator in Brooklyn. And we did this to combat historical, systemic, and institutionalized marginalization experienced by people of African descent. Our goal, like was mentioned earlier, is to centralize resources, information, and funds for Black people interested in buying land, as well as galvanize a community of concerned citizens. We aim to fund land projects that support the Black community artistically, economically, agriculturally, and educationally. I think it's been difficult for us to figure out what's the singular point of interest, because I don't have a singular point of interest. I'm not a one issue person. And Black land ownership, it's hard to tell people because they're like, you want to start a farm? No, I don't necessarily want to start a farm, but we could. That would be really awesome. Oh, you all want to raise money to help Black people buy a house and flip it. I didn't mention anything about flipping houses, but if more Black people can get involved in real estate and we are able to give them information or access to information or connect them with people or funds that can assist in that, let's talk about it. How do we do that responsibly? What are we flipping the houses for, right? And so there are three branches. If I were to break it down, there are three branches of Black land ownership. One is a for-profit branch. We're dealing with land. That's an asset. So we'd like to be able to purchase land, fix it, sell it, utilize it, charge rent if we're not using it, offer consultant services. Like once we've had enough experience in purchasing land, funding projects, development, to be able to sit with people and say, like, it normally costs you $5,000 to have a consultation. We'll do it for $500. You know, like we raise the money to cover the rest of the expenses. You just have to make sure that our offices, we keep our lights on. Then there's a not-for-profit section where we want to be engaged in educational endeavors, sustainability workshops, a think tank, research elements, and as a way to encourage people to use us as a proxy for stuff you don't want to do. So you don't want to look up the history of certain things? We'll look it up. You don't want to find out what's the process of starting a yurt when you are in Rhode Island in this specific county municipality? We'll look it up. We'd like to be able to do that. We'd like to be able to be a resource. You don't know who the Black engineers are in Colorado? Cool, we already found a list. We'll send it over to you. And then eventually we'd like to get into lobbying and policy. Now, I don't mean like lobbyists, like we don't listen to what the people want and we try to make the politicians do what isn't in our best interest because there's some industry. No, I mean, literally, we'd like to be able to raise money and contribute to politicians or legislation being passed that favors more Black land ownership. As of now, very few, if not any, of the politicians that I hear from are speaking about Black land ownership. They're talking about reparations, they're talking about affordable housing, they're talking about anti-poverty initiatives, but none are overtly discussing Black land ownership and the history of marginalization and dispossession of Black people. They'll talk about redlining, they'll talk about land possibly being used in a reparations discussion, but literally just getting up there and saying, do we even know how dire the situation is? Most of the politicians aren't doing it. And so policy issues that I would focus on and that are of most interest to me, not limited to, but include food insecurity, affordable housing, access to loans and mortgages if you'd like to purchase property. Because one thing to get a homeowner's loan, but if you want to get an agricultural loan, that's a whole nother animal. And your traditional banks don't do that. And the reality of the loss of property and the things that are happening now so that the grandparents, the great-grandparents, the parents are losing the property and the generation my age and younger aren't able to keep the property or aren't able to even purchase it from their parents. All right. So in terms of our fundraising, we have three different programs we're working on right now. One's a general fund, which is basically if you support what we do and you'd like to donate, it doesn't go towards anything specifically, but all the money goes to a Black land ownership account, Black land ownership PayPal, and it's used to keep our lights on. It's used that when we had to hire our lawyer to look over our easement, that's where the money goes. Then we have a 40-acre drive where we'd like to start an artist retreat and we'd like to purchase 40-acre plot where we can do cob house building workshops, where we can do sustainable agricultural processes workshops, where we can bring out students, where artists can get out of the city, come stay for 2 weeks at a time and just be in nature and make stuff and not worry about anything else, to where we can encourage Black folks to get out on the land. Because I know I talk to a lot of my friends and I'm like, come out to the rural America. They're like, no. You know how white people act out there? No. You know how the cops act out? No. You know how the state troopers act? No. You know how Park Service rangers? No. And so we want to have a space where we can tell people to the best of our ability, it's a safe space. To whether you have no experience hiking, have no experience in nature, come out with us. We're not going to let you get hurt. I mean, again, to the best of our ability, we're not going to let you get hurt. And we'll encourage the fact that you're unfamiliar with it and we're not going to make you feel bad about that. And there'll be other Black people out there with you and we'll learn together. And with the 40-acre project, it will also give us an opportunity to do an outdoor large music performance. I love outdoor festivals, but do you ever go to one that's not so specific, like Jazz Fest, what's all jazz musicians, or it's Bonnaroo? Well, a lot of my Black friends do not go to Bonnaroo. It's like, what sounds like fun? Not 20,000 white people on drugs in the middle of a field somewhere with no Black people. Now, again, everyone should be open to everyone, and we're working on that. But I have to also meet some of my friends where they are. And tens of thousands of white people on drugs in the middle of a place that has a history for not being nice to Black people just isn't always so welcoming. So we'd like to do something where we might not have tens of thousands of people out, but we have a couple hundred people out, have an outdoor festival, and we finally mix the banjos with the African drummers. We mix the poets with my friends that are singer-songwriters. We mix the hip-hop artists with folks that come out and do electronica and might have the theremin. And we'd like to do that and have enough space to do that properly and safely. Then there's a conservation fund where we are looking to raise money to purchase land to not do anything with it and to move away from this idea of exploitative use. Like anytime you tell people we're going to get land, what are you going to do with it? What are you going to use? How are you going to make money from it? What if we just want nature to exist? What if we just want the ducks to waddle? What if we just want the birds to go out there and flap, 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 and we want to go see them and want to go commune and just sit in the grass and listen to them all? That takes money. In order to not use things, you basically have to buy it to then say other people can't do stuff with it that would damage it. And so we can then put things in conservation easements. And it's not your hoarding where we just want it so no one can do anything. It's we want to make it available to the public, but to where the nature and the activities that are there are not harmed. I mean, if you notice when tourist activities pick up, or you go to an area that's secluded or that has this amazing nature, as soon as enough people know about it, it ruins the nature. We don't want to ruin the nature. Does that make sense? All right. And so is this organization inclusive of other groups? Yes. All right. So our research, although specific to the Black community, absolutely reveals the need to raise awareness for other marginalized groups, whether it's women, trans, indigenous, immigrants, and again, those intersect. I'm not saying it's either or, but people with limited resources and capital. And that as Black land ownership, we have to be inclusive of those groups. In our board and in our founding circle of folks, it is diverse. And I don't mean just in how people look, but I mean in thought, in experience, in background, in professional expertise. Our goal is to say, here's an opportunity for us, and to extend the us in the sense of, yes, Black land ownership, but the us are the groups of people that want space, want to be safe, want to not be crammed in these cities, and are normally given barriers, are normally given obstacles. And we're all going to work together to push, right? And so why use Black in the name of it's not only Black people? For me, it's imperative to recognize the outrageous mistreatment and disparity aimed at Black folks, but it's also to make us look into how colonialism has affected everyone and to look into the other groups that share a common experience with us and to work in solidarity. I think that's a word that in my youth was used frequently, and I often don't hear it anymore. And to me, solidarity is one of the most important elements of what we're pushing. So it means, yes, we're starting like, how's the Black community affected? How have Black people been affected? But that's only to build in solidarity with other folks, all right? And so when you look at the statistics of landowners of all private US agricultural land, 96% are white, 4% are Black, Native, and Hispanic. Now, white folks don't make up 96% of the population. So how do you have this disparity? When you look at acres owned, like not just the percentage of landowners, but the actual land itself of what percentage of acreage is owned by what groups, 98% of the land and the acreage owned in the US is owned by white folks. 2% of it is owned by Black, Native, and Hispanic. How is that even possible? All right, and so we're gonna explore that. And what are the repercussions? What are the consequences when you have that type of disparity? All right. And it's larger than America. When I first started looking into this, I spoke to my friend who worked at the UN, and I was like, is this something we could bring to the UN? Who can I speak to? How do I get this issue to more folks? And they were like, you know what? There's a whole thing about landless people. And I was like, what's that? What do you mean landless people? And they were like, anywhere you have a group of folks live where they have no access to land ownership, you notice police brutality or mistreatment by the military, paramilitary forces, economic ostracization, and you notice a displacement from political activities. If you aren't a landowner, you have so little say in what happens to you. And not just in America. In other countries, you can see this, whether it was in South Africa, to where Europeans owned more land than the native South Africans that have been there, what was formerly known as Rhodesia, or Zimbabwe, or the Democratic Republic of Congo. All these places, you notice Africans did not own the land in their own country. And you see what's happened in Ethiopia, where people were starving. There's enough land to grow enough food for all the people there, but the land is being used to grow flowers, coffee, to send over to Europe. All right. And so this is a human rights issue. It's not just a Black issue, and it's not just an American issue. Okay. All right. So that's a brief breakdown of us. And I'll go into the timeline and some of the other elements in a moment. But with that, are there any questions or any comments? We did have some questions over here in the chat I'll try to get to. But just for now, does everything make sense, or is there anything you'd like me to flesh out a little bit? We're good? We got a thumbs up? And someone asked, curious if any of your work around Black land ownership intersects with the preservation of historical Black cemetery sites. This is something I'm learning more about. This is a great question. One of our members, or one of, like, I would say board, where I try to stay away from official talk, but one of the homies, that's what I would say. He's the homie. I know him through doing rap music. He just happened to go to Harvard for grad school in architecture. And one of his areas of focus is historical preservation, and how historically the preservation sites have actually eliminated Blackness and preserved whiteness in a way that is imbalanced and totally inequitable. And you can see it. And so one of the things he's doing is looking into how we can use historical preservation to do things like look at preservation of historical sites like cemeteries, look at sites like historically Black beaches, whether it's in Martha's Vineyard, whether it's down in Maryland, down in Florida, and how to utilize this tool that has historically marginalized us and erased us from cities to keep us more visible, to keep us more present. As of now, I don't have any specific information about the cemeteries. I know there was an issue in the past 2 or 3 months, though, of a group of folks trying to get a cemetery preserved. And a lot of our cemeteries have already been built over, destroyed. I don't know if you saw this, the recent report of whole Black towns that were covered and turned into private lakes for white folks. I believe Lake Lanier is one of them down in Georgia. But we can get into that. That's a really good question, though. All right, so on to our timeline. I'm going to share my screen for this, and I'm not going to get into everything on the timeline, but I think it's important to identify how we end up now, because nothing exists in a vacuum. The reason why I titled this presentation, Nothing Exists in a Vacuum, is like we're often told to act as if we just are here now, as if nothing got us here, or as if there aren't any influences. And I fully believe in momentum, inertia, and corollary causation. I'm not a scientist, and so I can't prove every dot is connected objectively, but it appears as if some of these issues relate to what's happening now. So the major time periods I'd like to look at are pre-Civil War, 1820 to 1863, Emancipation, which is 1865, around that time period, Reconstruction, 1865 up to around the 1880s, Jim Crow, which 1870s all the way to the 1960s. Now, interesting that Reconstruction only lasted about 15 years, but Jim Crow and the response and the white folks being really nasty lasted a good 90 years. Turn of the century in the 1900s, World War I, 1912 to around, and the Great Depression. So up to about the 30s, like the consequences of World War I last until about the 30s. The war itself is over by around the 1917 or so. New Deal, which emerged as a response to the Great Depression, World War II, Civil Rights era, 1950s, late 60s, and then post-Civil Rights era, 70s and 80s, where you saw this pushback, and the Reagan era recession, turn of the century, economic downturn around 2008, 2009, and now COVID shelter in place. All of these issues listed to me have a strong influence on Black ownership in the history of America. All right, so we'll start with prior to the Civil War, the Missouri Compromise, which was passed in 1820, admitting Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state. What you'll notice is during this time period, almost all of the questions around new states being admitted or former territories turning into states, the question of slavery is involved. And the question of then, how do Black people have access to the land if we are property like land, if we are treated like chattel, right? So when we think about the Mexican-American War, and the subsequent annexation of Texas. Again, what will the role of the Africans be? All right. And then when you see by 1850, we have the Homesteading Act, again, Black folks are considered property during the Homesteading Act. So how do we take advantage of the Homesteading Act? There were specific administrators of the act who said, do not extend this to Black people. If there are freed Africans, still do not let them participate in this. Okay. And the Homesteading Act of 1850 has provided land for certain people that now are literally able to send their kids to college because they sold off some property they were awarded during the Homesteading Act of 1850s and 60s. All right. So once we go past the Homesteading Act, which is basically an act that said that if you went west, could claim a property, work the land and hold it for the next 7 years or however long against indigenous war and against other groups trying to take it, it's yours. And the government will help you keep it. All right. That's a very unique proposition. Can you imagine right now if the government was like, go to California, and if you can hold it down for however long, it's yours? That's a very strong advantage when it comes to generational wealth. All right. And so then when you get the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, and the emancipation that happened in 1863, you now have the split of the country, new lands opening west, and newly freed Black folks. And it brings up the issue of 40 acres and a mule, which was the Sherman Act, where former slaves and people who had been affected by slavery were going to have access to 40 acres and a mule and would be given land. Well, once Lincoln was assassinated and Andrew Johnson took over as president, he rescinded this order and then paid reparations out to white slave owners that had their slaves removed or who lost property during the end of the Civil War. Okay. And so when we're thinking about land, when you're a newly freed slave, how do you go get land? You buy it. With what money? You are a slave. You're able to facilitate the contract with what paperwork? You weren't allowed to read when you were on the plantation. You need a lawyer. What lawyers are going to help you? You're in rural Georgia. Oh, the lawyers will actually give you a bad deal so that you sign paperwork, which means you'll never be able to hold on to that land. You sign things that have restrictive covenants. All right. So when we start thinking about Black land ownership, we have to go back to the 1820s, 50s, 60s. Okay. So the 13th Amendment, as ratified, abolished slavery. You end up with the Reconstruction era. And part of Reconstruction is when the white Northerners wanted to punish the white Southerners. So they purposely put as many Black people in Congress as possible. They purposely put as many Black people in positions of power as possible. They purposely took land from Southern whites and gave it to Black people. Now, were all those Black people skilled in knowing what to do with those properties? Probably not. Did those white people then harbor a lot of animosity and antipathy towards the Black folks, not just the white people up north? Yes. So what happens in 1865? Ku Klux Klan was founded. Now, keep in mind, during Reconstruction, you had more people in Congress than almost any other time added up. You had more Black landowners. You had Black folks going into schools. You had the establishment of historically Black colleges and universities. Some people would say that Reconstruction was a time period of Black Renaissance. Now, I still don't know because there were people who didn't know slavery had ended. If we think about we celebrate Juneteenth, that's because 2 or 3 years after slavery had been abolished, folks found out. And that continued throughout the South. And so during that time period, though, you have the emergence of the Ku Klux Klan, where they ran people off the land, where they threatened Black people into not wanting to be on the land. And that helped establish this policy of rural areas are not safe for Black people unless you're in an all-Black neighborhood or an all-Black town. Okay. And that leads into with the Jim Crow segregation from the 1870s up to the 1960s. It's a system to enforce a racial caste system and terrorize Black folks. Which again will influence Black land ownership throughout the entire country. The Morrill Act is passed in the 1890s. World War I happens around the turn of the century. And so you look at the Great Migration. Once we have the turn of the century, you have the Great Migration, and really the great northward migration of Black migration was a movement of 6 million African Americans out of the rural southern United States to the urban Northeast, Midwest, and West between 1916 and the majority of it's before the 40s, but you have it continue up to the 1970s. During this migration, that's where you start seeing the movement of Black folks being renters in the North and tenement housing. Instead of us moving to the North and buying large properties, buying lots of land out in Wyoming, out in Colorado, out in Idaho, out in North Dakota, South Dakota. We go to Baltimore, we go to DC, we go to Philadelphia, we go to New York, we follow the jobs, we go to Chicago, we go to St. Louis, we go up the Mississippi River and we follow that, and we go out west to California. But a lot of that meant us not owning land, but us being renters in urban areas. Now, in other cases like DC, you did have a large number of Black landowners and people that were able to purchase properties in areas like Georgetown, where Black neighborhoods with Black homeowners. All right, so that's Great Migration. They have Great Depression and association, which brings us to the New Deal. And the New Deal coming out of the Great Depression is what started a series of public works projects, financial reforms and regulations enacted by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. One of them was a housing push, where the government thought it was in the best interest of all parties involved for there to be more homeowners. And with the GI Bill and people coming back from the military having a little bit extra money, the government said that they would insure the bank loans, because the banks are like, we don't want to give out loans to people that might not give us our money back. That's not how we make money. And the government says, we'll make sure that if they default, we'll pay. And the banks are like, wait, we can give out loans and you'll pay it if it doesn't come through? Perfect. Let's give out as many loans as possible all over the country. Well, the government, as well as private entities, started saying, yes, but don't give out loans in these areas that we have redlined, that we have outlined in red ink. Well, ironically or not, those areas happen to be Black neighborhoods. And so he started noticing that the Black neighborhoods couldn't get the funding or the loans to better themselves. They fall into decrepitude. People don't want to move there. So then they're even more isolated. And then once they are allowed to fall into disrepair, they get sold off below rate, and then new folks move in who are not like the Black people that were there. But the redlining is something that more in the past year or so has become known, and there's paperwork on it. But that emerged directly after the New Deal. And you'll see this, it's a systematic denial of various services by federal government agencies, local governments, as well as the private sectors, right? And that accompanies two other things: white flight, where white folks start leaving the cities, and they feel like they're becoming inundated with too many minorities, or it's becoming unsafe, and they leave and they go to the suburbs. But that also accompanies the highways being built and a national highway system. So when we think of Black land ownership, also, how do we get around? And are we limited by transportation? And so why is it so many Black folks are crammed into cities as renters, and all of a sudden the white folks are expanding into rural areas with acres and big houses? Well, this highway system and cars and access and travel. All right. And so then, so Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, national origin. Keep in mind, prior to that, you could blatantly say Black people can't buy this house. We don't sell to Black folks. We don't let them move in this neighborhood. There's a restrictive covenant that you're not allowed to sell. If you, as a non-Black person, I'm just making an assumption here. I don't know what your actual background is, Claudia. But if you own a house and you go to sell it to me, you could get fined because you would sign a covenant saying you would not sell to a Black person. Well, after 1964, that was illegal. They found other ways to do that. But prior, you could outright just not sell to Black folks. And the Equal Housing Act of 1968 is a landmark law in the United States signed by Lyndon B. Johnson in response to the assassination of Martin Luther King and the riots that ensued, and making it direct that, especially with housing, you cannot withhold sale or you cannot withhold loan due to race. And so then in response to the 1960s, 1970s, you have the 80s and the Reaganomics and the push against affirmative action, the push against any headway that was made by folks of African descent, and to rescind it all. And to say, that's unfair, that's quotas. White men are being mistreated now because of these rules. And you notice in economic policies and government community organization and the funding, all of that got rescinded during the 80s. And there's also then the crash, the economic crash of the 80s, which removed more land from Black people. And there were no programs put in place to make sure that we didn't lose it. When you look again in the 90s, huge growth, and the Clinton era, a lot of money, everyone's doing well. Well, did Black people all of a sudden own more land during that time period than any other? No, they actually owned more land in 1890 than 1995. How'd that happen? And people would say, well, that's a move from ruralism to urbanism. No, because white folks still own land in these urban areas. Why don't Black people? Okay, we'll get into that. And the housing crash of 2007, 2008, more than a fifth of Black homes were lost. And the percentage between it, the Black community and white community was nowhere near equitable of how much property was lost in that economic turmoil. And you notice the same thing during coronavirus in the past 2 years. And we don't know what's going to happen now that the moratorium is being lifted on evictions and on the mortgage bailouts. All right. So in this, we do have to consider FICO and how credit is used, and the rise of credit in around the 50s or 60s, but how it's really implemented in the 80s. And keeping in mind that this is on record. Any of the things that I'm saying, you can disagree, but we can find the information. And one of the proofs is that USDA suit, Glickman versus Pickford, is a class action suit against the United States Department of Agriculture alleging racial discrimination against farmers in its allocation of farm loans and assistance between 1981 and 1996. They lost the case. The government lost the case, was forced to pay out, and then refused to pay out. So they got sued again and lost again. The government almost never admits fault when it comes to these large scale issues. And they've had to now twice when it comes to racism and loans and Black farmers. Okay, does this make sense? All right, so that is our timeline. I know it's a lot. I know it's a very large timeline. We went through a lot. Does it make sense though, why we have to talk about that timeline before we get to where we are now? All right, good. Is there anyone that had a question, or is anyone that was like, oh, I never heard of one of those things, or I don't quite understand one of those things? Yes, my friend, Karen.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, that was a lot, and you made a very strong case showing the discrimination and the oppression, etc. I was just curious though, because the whole notion of private land ownership, per my understanding, was more of a European notion that was brought over here by the colonizers, and land was made a commodity within capitalism. And so some theorists or analysts will say that that is a core part of the whole problem, is the whole notion of private land ownership and the whole fact that land was commodified under capitalism. And so I'm wondering to what extent you agree with that, and to what extent, if that is a core cause of the problem, to what extent can it be solved within that same paradigm?
Good. I'm a firm believer that you cannot use the same elements of the machine to build it differently. Like if we take all the core elements of capitalism, shift them around, we'll still end up with capitalism. So on one hand, I agree with you that we have to go to the root. I don't know where I fall in line with current rhetoric or nomenclature as to what to name myself, but I'm interested in critical theory and Marxist analysis of capitalism as an economic form and the inherent exploitation that you find in capitalism, whether it's the exploitation of resources, the earth, or each other. I think the only way to manage the majority of our issues is to go to that root. I've also accepted most people aren't willing to do that. Most people at this point are not going to really question land ownership and their right to own a home or their right to control their space. So while I'm having the general conversation of, do we need to change our understanding of private property, land ownership, and how we engage with the land and what the corporations can do with it? Yes. Are there things we can do to take advantage of the current system? And I don't mean to hurt people take advantage, but to literally say, if we need public space, how do we use private ownership to facilitate public space? We raise the money and we buy it. How do we utilize private ownership to keep ourselves safe? It means that once I own this property, I wish I could say this better, white people with guns can't walk on it threatening my Black friends that want to go hiking. And so it's a stopgap. It's literally a short-term response to hundreds of years of issues that will probably take hundreds of years to sort. And I'm going to get into this a little bit later, why I chose Black land ownership and why I'm okay saying that at heart, I have a huge problem with the way private ownership works and private property works in this country. But I also am totally comfortable saying Black people need space in this country. Black people need land. And if we need land to grow the food, we're not going to get healthy food if we don't own the land. Relying on the other, because they own it. Unless everyone else is giving up their land, I don't believe Black folks should be the target of the discussion around it's wrong to own land. I just, I can't put things in a hierarchy of suffering or pain or any of that. And I don't really want to do that, but I can be direct and say, take it up with the colonists first. Once you sort it all out with them, I'm definitely down to speak on how we've also contributed. Because don't get me wrong, as Americans, Black folk have done what Americans do. So we have misused resources. We have exploited each other and the planet. We have done things with profit as the motivating catalyst. And we're gonna have to fix that as a Black community to sort our own issues. But in my mind, that's for the Black community. We talk about that. Other people, y'all need to sort out what y'all are doing. And because it affects us, we're gonna talk about that also. But I think the general issue of land ownership and how we understand land ownership, hugely problematic, rooted in colonialism. Now, do I believe that the indigenous and the Africans and the non-Europeans had a perfect system where everyone got along? No. They went to war before the white people got here, before the colonists got here. Now, was the war different? Was it for different means or purposes? Did it manifest differently? Were the consequences different? Yes. So I'm also not a believer that it was all perfect at any point anywhere. And that humans for a long time have been trying to sort out how to manage limited resources and space. But definitely other people have done it without killing each other off, for sure. Were there any other questions? All right, good. We're moving. I like this. We got a nice little speed going here. All right, and so now I'll get into some of the things that have stripped us of land, because I gave a brief understanding of what has prevented us from accessing land. But once we have it, what happened? So that in 1890, more Black people have land than now. One is tax policies, right? If Black people aren't involved in legislation, you have non-Black people who are, they go in and they say, keep raising property taxes. And the poor people can't afford it. Well, we know that Black folks are disproportionately affected by disparity in income. So if you have an area of a lot of poor Black folks, raise the property taxes, they can't afford it. The houses then are turned over to the municipality, and very wealthy white folks buy it at the lowest rate you could imagine. And then once they own it, they go back in, they change the legislation, and all of a sudden the tax policy is lowered again. You can look at heirs laws, which is basically how is property transferred? I'm researching this and haven't been able to get a lot of information, but how much property is tied up in probate right now in this country? And I don't know if any of you all have had elders or people in your family that passed away, but even if they have a will, it's not like the property immediately transfers. There has to be a time period for creditors to check in, for family members to contest, all this other stuff. So unless there's a trust, and unless that trust has been adjudicated a particular way, the property always gets tied up for a certain amount of time. Now, what happens when you're Black and you didn't have access, like again, we're talking about 1880s, 1890s, you don't have access to a lawyer. You don't have access to paperwork. You didn't do a will. You have a verbal contract that says, my son gets the property when I die. Then the son leaves the property to the granddaughter. And the granddaughter tries to go file with the clerk. And the clerk says, we don't have anything on paper saying you own any of this stuff. What? Go spend $30,000 on a lawyer, figure it out. And another entity comes in and says, no, I have a lawyer and I can prove that the sale conducted between this person and that was faulty and illegitimate, and that this should be open on the market, or the state should be in charge of it and we could buy it from the state. There are various ways that you can do it. You can look at how inheritances have robbed Black folks of property they owned. And again, even dealing with going to the county office, can you imagine dealing with the Ku Klux Klan member who works as the town clerk back in 1910? When you have to go adjudicate your property and there's a conflict with another entity in town that claims there's a debt and that entity is either a bank or a white-owned institution. How does that work out? Okay. And so there are whole organizations that deal with heirs laws and how inheritance problems and probate are used as tools to remove Black folks from their land. Another one is a partition sale, where basically if Mike, you and I are in a family and we own a property, we are in different generations. So I'm older than you in this case. So I have 10 acres. Then you, Marissa, Eli, and Ella are all siblings. You're all 4 in the generation below me. I pass away, I leave the property to you. You're able to deal with inheritance. The 4 of you all own it. In certain states, it's required that all 4 of you sign off to sell the property. and you have to sign off on that. You can't sell your equity or your part of it. All four have to agree to selling the entire property. In other states, you can sell a portion or whatever your equity is in the property off to an outsider. So you don't want to have anything to do with it. You sell your property off to Lowe's. Then Lowe's comes and talks to Eli and says, I want to buy your part too. So there are four people involved. Eli and Mike have sold off their parts to Lowe's. What Lowe's can do now, even though it's only 50% owner, come in, they can then claim the other two people are unfit owners and via court and paperwork, get them removed from decision-making on the property. And now Lowe's becomes the sole owner of this property. Does that make sense? It's confusing, but that's what happens. And so using partition sale, people get leveraged off their own property. All right. So now that we have that, let me go back to my trusty dusty thing. So then violence. We talked about the Ku Klux Klan, and we talked about the fact that you get intimidated. I went out to visit an area in Illinois that was south of Chicago in Peoria. It's where University of Chicago is, I believe. No, University of Illinois is in Peoria. And I was speaking to a guy there. We were hanging out and we were freestyling at the end of the night. And he was like, yo, this is the longest conversation I've had with a Black person. And I'm like, how? You live an hour from Chicago. And he was like, yeah, but the town where I am, my grandmother's only talked to one Black person in the past 10 years. Anyone who moved there, we run them out. And I looked at him like, is this 1930? He was like, no, we run them out. Like I'm not with that. Like, that's why I moved to, and I'm going to school near Chicago. But my grandparents' generation, they make it so hard and so difficult that no Black person would want to stay there. And so Black people buy the property and they realize it's not worth it. And if you've seen this movie, Them, not movie, it's a TV show, I think on either FX or Amazon Prime or something. It's a horror and it's pretty, some people would say it's trauma porn, but it deals with a Black family that moves in this community that make it so you do not want to be there. And the Black community is like, you're not going to make us leave. And you see the immovable object and unstoppable force, what happens with a little bit of horror. But the principle underlying it is real, it's salient. All right. Violence and the threat of violence and the torture. If you send your kids to the school and they're getting suspended and expelled at an unreasonable rate, if they're getting bullied, if the teachers bully them, if they're getting hurt and no one's trying to protect them, if the police decide to focus on them solely, so there are other ways to keep people from living in certain places besides just refusing to sell to them or refusing to give them a loan. All right. Does this make sense? All right. So we did heirs, dollars, partition sales, violence, and anti-ruralism. Like, we aren't encouraged. Like, one of the things that keeps people off the land is move to the big cities and start renting. I'm now on the opposite of like, stop renting. Go buy property in the middle of nowhere you might never go to, but go buy it, own something, get the equity, learn how you have to start a business to do that. I can't explain. It doesn't make sense. People be like, why own property you never go to? Why are we renting? Why? I've spent, my apartment on average is $2,000 a month. I don't pay but for the entire apartment, 3-bedroom apartment, has been $2,500, if not more, for however long. I've lived there 11 years. We've given them over $200,000. That's a down payment on a $2 million property. And when I leave, they get all the benefits, all the improvement I've made to my apartment, all the changes we've made, all the painting, all the woodwork. I leave with no equity. I leave with nothing. The same thing that I started with. All right. And so we're trying to push against that sentiment of I know that Black folks in my family who are like, owning property is too difficult. You have to pay the taxes. You have to. But what happens when we don't own anything and we're all renters? What's going to happen then to us as a community? Okay. Does this make sense? All right. So I'm going to share some statistics with you all. And I'm purposely not a huge statistics person. I want to get into the meat of it and the ideology and the feeling and emotion so that you can go look up the statistics. You can memorize demographics, but the heart of it and the reason this is important is something that I don't think you get from just reading an article. I think you got to see this impassioned face and you got to hear it in my voice and understand that this is real, So let me share my screen here. But on to some statistics. All right, can everyone see that? Number of Black farmers over the past century? Yeah. So in numbers of just Black farmers, there were over 90,000 Black farmers back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Now we are literally under 30,000. Okay. And again, in general, in the US, the number of farmers has decreased and the number of farms has decreased. And the sizes, though, of the farms have increased as the trend towards like agribusiness continues. So you have fewer farms, fewer owned by individuals, more owned by corporations, and they're much larger. And it would be untenable, unable, like no family could run some of these huge agri farms. Now, keep in mind, back on the capitalism discussion, Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations, said that the capitalists, the epitome of the capitalist would be the yeoman, who is the individual farmer, the self-sustained, not big farm with 30 different people working it, and not the uber capitalist that hoards their resources, but the person that has land, they make stuff from the land and they manage it with them and their family and small group of friends. And now how many farms can operate like that? How many distribution chains can operate like that, right? So something to keep in mind. Black farmers' share of direct loans. You're looking at that number, less than 4% of direct loans go to Black folks. We make up, depending on what you believe, over 13 to 15% of the population in America. I'll go higher. I think there are a bunch of folks that are considered Latinx or Spanish speaking or whichever way you like to name, self-name, that in my mind are of African descent. I know a ton of folks that are Puerto Rican, Dominican, Brazilian, who, when I look at them, we know, but they would not call themselves Black. I include them in this number. There are indigenous people that are not included in Black. I include them because there, in my mind, there is proof of Africans coming over and having communities with the indigenous as well as Africans coming over before the Europeans came and being a part of the indigenous, okay? And a lot of indigenous would not consider themselves African or Black. But even if we're 20%, how is it only we get 4% of the loans? And what does that mean then for the opportunity for us to grow our businesses or to grow our farms or when something goes wrong in order for us to sustain, okay? Then the percentage of farmland owned in the past century, as you see, again, Black folks, constant decline. And then the status of USDA direct loan applications for each race and ethnicity group. So you see the total number that go in, and then you see the approved, rejected, and withdrawn. Now, with white, non-Hispanic, 71% approval rate. With Black, 37% approval rate. So either Black people don't know how to read or write or apply for things, or there's some disparity. Now, a person could say, well, we don't mean they inherently don't know how. So of course, Black people aren't inherently unable, but that due to social imbalance and the history of how white folks have isolated Black folks haven't been given the guidance. They haven't been given the mentorship programs. They haven't been given the tools to be able to do the applications correctly. Still borderline racist, but at least you're saying there is another influence. It's not just that Black folks don't know how, it's that white folks have done stuff to damage the opportunity for Black folks. But even then, does that account for 71% approval rate for white folks and 37% for Black? Do Pacific Islanders have an inherent ability, or Native and Indigenous an inherent ability, or Asians have an inherent ability to not do it well? No. So there's something else going on here that we'd like to investigate. 1920, we have 925,000 African-American farms. Now 45,000. So 75,000 short of 1 million. And now we're at less than 50,000. So you can see 14% of farms in America were Black. Now 1% of rural landowners and 2% of the farmers. The acres owned, I think I mentioned this statistic earlier. 98% white, 2% Black, Native, and Hispanic. And to the general stat of urbanism and people leaving rural areas and anti-rural sentiment, sure, there have been a decrease in number of farmers in general in the US from 1900 to 1997. So 60% of a difference for white folks. It's 97% of a difference for Black folks. Only 3% remain. Whereas over 35% remain for white folks. Okay. So, and then when we look at landowners, I think we discussed this one about the private U.S. agricultural land. There's also something to keep in mind that when we think of land ownership, it's not just private. Corporate land ownership is major in rural areas. And one of the reasons why I'm interested in Black land ownership is to get us in before the corporations buy all of it. And that we get some of that money when the corporations buy out all the other landowners. Because once they own it, they're not selling it back. And if they do, it will not be in our favor. All right. And the value of land, over $1 trillion is tied up in the land owned by white folks. Only 3% of that 1 trillion goes to Black folks, Natives and Hispanic people. So 97% of over $1.2 trillion is in the hands of one group of people. Okay. And we know that land and property ownership heavily influences your credit rating, heavily influences what you have for collateral, heavily influences your ability to liquidate assets or when things go wrong, and then have influence when it comes to government. When we think about our education system, property taxes pay for a lot of schools. And we notice a direct correlation between the materials available and the budgets available for schools and property taxes. So who owns what will influence how well your children get educated. All right. All right. So that is some of our statistics when we're talking about displacement and people being removed. Do we have any questions? All right. Wow, we're running through this. This is actually, the time's moving quicker than I would have imagined. All right. So really quickly, I'm going to go through some of the consequences, and then we will have a Q&A. So some of the consequences when it comes to the disparity in ownership, look at food security, housing, generational wealth. If we don't own the land, how do we ensure we have access to the food that's healthy? How do we create distribution routes? How do we have more control on what's made available to us? Food security is a major issue for many people, even in rural areas. It's ironic. Like, I spoke to a farmer in Georgia that was saying that they couldn't get locally grown vegetables. We're near Augusta, Georgia. Like, all the farms there were growing cash crops like soybeans. And there are no local farms that were growing vegetables that could sustain themselves financially. So like any of the smaller farms that wanted to grow lettuce or wanted to grow cabbage could not sustain themselves. Now we're tied into that loan issue. And this immediately ties into health and medical consequences. And in the Black folks, we already know there's disparity in that arena. Food systems and health systems are inextricably linked. And we see a disparity in medical treatment towards people of African descent, such as higher rates of misdiagnosis, dismissal of claims, not taking patients seriously, denial of service, callous treatment, and a lack of access to preventative care. And don't forget racist insurance policies and programs. So if we're not getting the healthy food on the front end, and then we're getting that type of medical treatment, how are we going to manage heart disease, diabetes, hypertension, and some of the other health issues that we deal with that are diet and nutrition related? In terms of housing, what happens when everyone's a renter? What happens when the landlords have more influence over city council than the 30 people that live in the building? What happens when schools and police are developed without thought of the people that live in the area, but are developed with the property in mind, protecting the property, not the people, and the people don't own the property. There are folks that had family land, and instead of taking out loans, sold grandmother's property, sent their kids to school, college, so no college loans. Or they used their family property during this pandemic to escape. How many of my Black friends had a second or third family house in a rural area to escape to? And if they went out there, how welcome did they feel in those rural areas? How safe did they feel in some of those rural areas that were refuge for some of my other friends? Now, keep in mind, I mentioned this earlier, in America, in its inception, you're only treated like a citizen if you're a white land-owning male. They added amendments to the Constitution to prevent discrimination, so the white male parts have been mitigated, theoretically. But do we ever think about the different rights afforded to landowners? Do landowners actually have different rights versus renters in this country? I would look into that. When we think about generational wealth, we see a direct tie-in between home ownership and land ownership and having generational wealth. It's the single largest contributing factor to the retention of generational wealth. And if you consider it from Marxist perspective, I don't mean like socialist communist, but a material understanding of how capital is generated. Land is necessary in order to generate capital and retain capital. All right. So if you run a business, you need land. Up until the internet, up until like now, you would need to either own or rent the land to run your business, or to extricate things from the land, or to grow your food or whatever, to then generate revenue. And hopefully you make enough money that you then can rent or buy a place to live. Now, again, you're paying for space. So once you own the land on which you work, like you buy a place to run your business and you buy a place on which you live, you can now generate capital. You're no longer spending capital. That's how you actually accumulate wealth. Until you are generating capital from work and your property, you will always be spending money. And it's an equation of, can you spend less than you make? And usually no. All right. And black folks have been blockaded from this economic opportunity for centuries. So instead of me saying, Black people, get money, get money, get money, I don't think capitalism saves Black people. I'm saying get land. Let's create safe spaces for communities to blossom. Let's establish more autonomy for our municipalities. And let's then understand how we generate capital, how we use our labor, and how we utilize the earth in a more responsible manner. Okay. And now, for the last part, the intersectionality, because that's part of what we're here for. Nothing exists in a vacuum. Black people do not exist solely for themselves. We work with other communities. And this is my bias. I think Black people have been the most welcoming of any group I can think of in the US. We have literally accepted any group of folks that said they wanted to work with us. Now, have we espoused nationalist ideology? Yes. And have Black people had some issues with accepting international people? Yes. Have we accepted some of the notions around religious conservatism? Yes. And so can we do a better job in welcoming members of the queer community, trans community? And yes, part of that though is because we're American. Black people are not separate from that, and we've been affected by the American ethos. I don't think we are more violent than any other group. I don't think we are more anti-queer than any group. I don't think we are more anti-migrants than any other group. But what I have known is that it was Black folks that were talking about Chavez, like the farm worker, not Hugo Chavez, but when I was younger, it was Black folks that were welcoming and saying that, no, we got to work with the indigenous people and the native people, and that the Seminole, that's not an actual tribe. That's a name given to a group of Africans, indigenous, and people that said they were not going to support the colonial and slave system, and all absconded together. And it's been Black folks that have said, we will work with white communities, even though white community has done whatever to us. We will work with white communities if they're down to do the work. And so when we think about Black land ownership, intersectionality is the key. It's an issue that reveals how other groups have been affected, right, by hegemony and prevented from having access to space. Women, queer folks, trans women who are queer, migrants, indigenous, have all historically been met with challenges when it comes to land ownership. We have to work together. If white folks support reparations, but don't want to wait for the government, Black land ownership, let's go, let's work together. Don't wait for the government. Put your money up, put your time up, put your labor up. If people want to make spaces for indigenous communities, let's go, let's work. Let's find the folks who self-identify and who say they're indigenous, and what can we do to bolster and help that community to be supportive? How, when we purchase land, can we make sure they're given opportunities to build with us and work with us? You know, if people want to create retreat centers in rural areas for trans folks and they know they can be safe, that's what we love to hear. Let's work on this together. Let's get everyone at the table and see the solidarity. Part of why I developed Black land ownership was to get past divisiveness and arguments within communities of people that are in general like-minded. For example, I made a list of a lot of issues affecting the Black community. I mean, a huge list, like anything you can name one. Education, housing, police, violence, gangs, drugs, economic disparity, prison industrial complex, lack of ownership in the media, healthcare, anything you can think of, political and social. And there wasn't a single thing I could identify that wasn't contentious within the Black community. So even in like how to deal with racism, there are Black people who say racism doesn't exist. And there are Black people who say all white people are racist, Afro-pessimism, don't deal with them at all. We're not going to have agreement. Or with abortion, there's no way all the homies will agree. There are young people in New York that will say it's a women's rights issue and preventing the choice is anti-woman, that if you make abortion illegal, you hate women. And then there's some old Black lady in Alabama that thinks she is protecting Black women by not allowing abortions. She thinks because she loves Black women, abortion shouldn't be legal. They're not going to agree. When it comes to schools, some people say, don't rely on the government, it's never going to work. Other people say we pay our taxes. Every single citizen should have access to the same quality of education, make them do their jobs. When it comes to the police, defund the police. Well, I know Black people who are like, what do you mean defund the police? We need the police where we live. You ever been to Brownsville? And other people who are like, no, if the money went into education, community centers, and counseling, and other facilities, we wouldn't need the police the way we do. Again, we won't agree. But Black land ownership is the only thing I can identify where, what's the contention? What's the issue? What are we really arguing about? What's the back and forth going to be? There really isn't much of one. We know that historically Black people have been marginalized and dispossessed, and we know that it was purposeful. You can read the documents by Lincoln, Johnson, all the way through Lyndon B. Johnson, all the way through Reagan. You can see what they've said about us in our communities. You can see what the bankers have said about us in our communities. And so not only does it tie into the other issues, it's also not polarized. It's not politicized. It's not already aligned with Democrat or Republican. No one really talks about it. So we haven't hit the barrier. We haven't hit the wall of we tried everything. We haven't. We really are a nascent stage of managing this issue. And there's objective proof that Black folks have been obstructed from owning land and that we've been stripped from it. So let's rectify that, period. We need a strategy. All right. So in general, that's my interest. That's why I'm doing Black land ownership. That's kind of like a breakdown of what it is, what we're here to do, what my interests are. And I hope it makes sense. I'd like to thank you all for participating. And if you have any questions, let me know. If I know I went through a lot of information, but if you have questions about anything, let's ask. I'm free to go till whatever time, probably like 9:15, 9:20, whatever. I don't know how late y'all are here. But I'd love to hear from you. I'd really love to hear your questions or what you take away from this and what we're going to do moving forward. Because it's not about just me naming issues. It's so now what?